A rich man named Daniel had lived in London for 15 years. He was the oldest son of his parents and had left his hometown for London at the age of 25. Now, at 40 years old, Daniel had spent the past 10 years taking care of his family's needs. He paid his younger siblings' school fees without fail and ensured that everyone was doing well. His family loved and cherished him, and they all wished for his return so they could finally see him again after so many years apart. Everyone adored Daniel because he was always willing and able to solve their financial problems. He had set up 2 of his siblings in business, and both were now doing well. His second brother was already married and had a son. Daniel's generosity and selflessness made him deeply loved, as he always had his family at heart. His mother prayed for him every day, declaring positive words over his life, grateful that he never allowed her to lack anything. Despite all his success and the love he received from his family, Daniel knew that time was passing. He was no longer getting any younger, and one morning, he woke up with the thought of settling down and starting a family. He longed to have children who could one day take over from him and manage his assets wisely. He wanted to ensure that everything he had worked hard for would remain in good hands. Daniel had always desired to marry an African woman, just like him. Though he had spent many years in London, he had never considered marrying a white lady. He believed that an African wife would understand his values, traditions, and the importance of family, just as he did. His dream was to find a wife who would support him, love him, and help him continue the legacy of taking care of their extended family. As days went by, Daniel became more determined to make this dream a reality. He began making plans to travel back to his hometown, not only to see his family but also to find the right woman to marry. His family, especially his mother, was overjoyed when they heard about his plans. They eagerly awaited his arrival, excited that he was finally ready to take the next step in life. However, Daniel knew that choosing a life partner was not something to rush into. He wanted a woman with a good heart, someone who would love him for who he was and not just for his wealth. He wanted a woman who would cherish his family as much as he did and who would help him raise their future children with strong values. With a heart full of hope, Daniel prepared for his journey home, ready to embrace the next chapter of his life. Would he find the love he was searching for? Only time would tell. One morning, Daniel woke up and decided to travel to his hometown to find a wife. However, on second thought, he wanted to test his family to see if their love for him was genuine or if they only cherished him because of what he did for them. A plan formed in his mind: he would disguise himself and pretend that he had been deported to see how they would react. Meanwhile, Daniel's mother had grown old, and due to her frail health, the family had hired a maid named Isabella to take care of her. Isabella was a kind-hearted young woman who had served the family for some time, ensuring that Daniel's mother was well cared for. For months later, Daniel finalized his plans to visit home. He booked his flight ticket and took care of all necessary arrangements. Though he was a multimillionaire, he did not want his family to know his true worth. Instead, he decided to tell them that he had been deported due to a crime, just to see their reaction. The next morning, Daniel arrived in Abuja. Instead of heading straight home, he checked into a hotel, where he spent a week preparing for his arrival. He let his hair grow unkempt for over a month, refusing to shave or groom himself so that he would appear poor and downtrodden upon his return. He wanted to make sure that his family saw him in a different light, without his wealth and influence, to reveal their true feelings toward him. 1 week later, Daniel finally made his way to his hometown. As he approached his family home, his heart pounded in his chest. He was eager to see his mother and siblings, but at the same time, he feared what their reactions might be. Upon reaching the doorstep, he met his youngest sister, Joan. However, she did not recognize him due to his disheveled appearance. His clothes were worn, his hair was wild, and his face carried the weariness of someone who had been through hardship. "Joan, it's me, your brother Daniel. Don't you recognize me?" he asked, his voice filled with expectation. Joan stared at him in shock. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Without saying a word, she ran inside to call the rest of the family. Moments later, his siblings emerged one after another. They all stood there, staring at him, their faces filled with disbelief. However, none of them rushed to embrace him. Not even the ones he had helped set up in business showed him any warmth. Daniel felt a pang of disappointment in his heart. He had parked his luxury car and the items he had bought for his family at a friend's house in a neighboring village, ensuring that they would not suspect his true status. He wanted to see their raw, unfiltered reaction to his supposed misfortune. Then, his mother appeared. The moment she saw her son's face, she grew concerned. "My son, I hope everything is okay with you," she asked, worried evident in her voice. She looked around at her other children and noticed their coldness toward Daniel. Confused, she turned to them and asked, "Why are you not celebrating your brother's return?" One by one, Daniel's siblings disappeared, making excuses to leave. None of them wanted to be associated with him now that he appeared to be struggling. His mother, however, remained by his side. She sat quietly for a moment, observing her son's tired expression before she spoke again. "What happened to you, my son?" she asked softly. Daniel took a deep breath and lowered his gaze. "Mother, I was deported," he said. "I lost everything I had worked for all these years." His mother gasped, her eyes filled with sorrow. At that moment, Isabella, the maid, who had been silently standing nearby, overheard their conversation. Her heart ached for Daniel. Unlike his siblings, she saw the pain in his eyes and felt pity for him. While his siblings avoided him, refusing even to offer him food or ask how he was doing, Isabella couldn't hold back her concern. She watched as Daniel sat there, broken and abandoned by those he had once cared for the most. Daniel realized the painful truth: his siblings' love had never been genuine. It was his money they loved, not him. As he sat with his mother, he pondered his next move. Would he reveal the truth about his wealth, or would he let his family's actions determine his future with them? One thing was clear: this experience had opened his eyes, and things would never be the same again. Isabella, out of the kindness of her heart, went into the kitchen and prepared a delicious meal for Daniel. She had been observing everything that had happened since his return and felt deeply sorry for him. Unlike his siblings, who showed no concern, she couldn't stand to see him suffer. When the food was ready, she served it to Daniel with a warm smile. He ate in silence, savoring each bite, but what truly touched him was not the food, it was the kindness behind it. After finishing his meal, Daniel looked up at Isabella with gratitude. "Thank you, Isabella," he said sincerely. "You don't know how much this means to me." She smiled shyly and responded, "It's nothing, sir. You've done so much for this family, and I believe you deserve better." Daniel's mother, who had been sitting nearby, watched the interaction closely. She could see the appreciation in her son's eyes, and for the first time, she felt a sense of relief. At least someone in this house still had a heart. She gently placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder and said, "My son, do not let this situation break you. You are a strong man. Keep believing in yourself, and never give up on your dreams and ambitions." As the days passed, Daniel's brothers continued to show no concern for his well-being. Even after hearing his heartbreaking story about being deported, they remained indifferent. They had gotten so used to receiving from him that now that he was supposedly struggling, he no longer had any value to them. One morning, Daniel decided to test his siblings once again. He pretended that he had no money and needed to go see a friend. He approached his brothers and asked if any of them could lend him some cash for transportation. Instead of showing concern, they burst into laughter. "Look at you, our big brother, asking us for money," one of them mocked. Another brother, whom Daniel had personally set up in business, shook his head and said, "Times are hard. We can't afford to give out money anyhow." Their selfishness and cruelty hit Daniel like a dagger to the heart. These were the same people he had taken care of for years, the same people he had lifted out of poverty. And yet, now that he was in need, they had turned their backs on him without hesitation. He sighed deeply, hiding the pain that welled up inside him. So, it was never me they loved, it was my money. Just then, Isabella, who had been standing in the hallway, overheard the conversation. She had heard how Daniel's own blood brothers had mocked him and refused to help. Without hesitation, she went to her room, opened a small wooden box, and took out some money she had been saving from her salary. Walking up to Daniel, she handed the money to him. "Here, take this. It's not much, but it should be enough to get you where you need to go," she said softly. Daniel was stunned. He looked at her, not knowing what to say. This was a young woman who earned very little, yet she was willing to part with her savings just to help him. Meanwhile, his wealthy siblings had refused to give him a single coin. His heart swelled with emotion as he took the money from her hands. "Thank you, Isabella," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "You are truly an angel." At that moment, Daniel felt something shift within him. He began to see Isabella in a different light. Her kindness, selflessness, and pure heart were qualities he had never noticed before. He couldn't help but compare her to his own family, who had shown him nothing but greed and selfishness. As he walked away, he found himself deep in thought. He went to a quiet place where he could reflect on everything that had happened. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Isabella was the only person who had shown him true care and compassion since his return. Why does a stranger care for me more than my own blood relatives? He wondered. With each passing day, Daniel found himself drawn closer to Isabella. He started paying more attention to her, noticing the way she carried herself with humility and grace. The thought of making her his wife entered his mind, and the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. One morning, Daniel decided it was time to address his family. He called for a family meeting, making sure that all his siblings and his mother were present. As everyone gathered in the sitting room, Daniel welcomed them and thanked them for honoring his call. He cleared his throat and began to speak. "As you all know, I was deported and lost everything I had worked for," he said. Immediately, his brothers frowned, already assuming that he was about to ask them for money. They exchanged irritated glances, their impatience evident. Daniel noticed their reactions but chose to ignore them. He continued, "I am no longer getting any younger, and I believe it is time for me to settle down and start a family." Before he could finish his sentence, his younger brother stood up abruptly and said, "Brother, please get straight to the point. We have businesses to run and don't have all day for this discussion." Daniel begged his siblings to contribute money for him to take a wife, but instead of helping, they laughed at him and hurled insults. They mocked him relentlessly, showing no sympathy for his supposed downfall. His mother, however, was against their behavior, but because of her old age, they paid no attention to her words. At the end of the meeting, they all claimed they had no money and left one after the other, leaving Daniel alone with his mother. Frustrated and hurt, Daniel turned to his mother and asked angrily, "Are you sure these are my siblings? The way they insulted me earlier made me so uncomfortable." His mother, disheartened by the situation, sighed deeply and went into her room. A few moments later, she returned with a small nylon bag tied with a green rope. She carefully untied it and took out some money, handing it to her son. "My son, this is too little, but please manage it," she said with a heavy heart. Daniel pulled his chair closer to his mother and whispered, "Who is this Isabella, and where is she from?" His mother smiled and replied, "Isabella is my friend's granddaughter. She has been taking care of me for the past few years now." She began to praise Isabella, saying, "She is a young, beautiful, well-mannered woman with a kind heart. I have lacked nothing ever since she came into this house." Daniel smiled and said, "Isabella is indeed a good woman. The day she heard I was deported, she gave me some money. I'm thinking of making her my wife. His mother, knowing that Daniel had supposedly lost everything, looked at him with concern. My son, how are you going to raise the money to marry Isabella? She asked. Daniel smiled confidently and reassured her, don't worry, mother. God will definitely provide. The next morning, Daniel went to a salon and had his hair cut. He then went shopping, making his way to his friend's house to retrieve his car. From there, he drove straight to a shopping complex down the street. He bought a lot of items for his mother, Isabella, and himself. When he returned home and handed the gifts to his mother, she was taken aback. She stared at him in shock, noticing the drastic change in his appearance. Still gazing at him in disbelief, she asked, Daniel, what is going on? Daniel smiled and finally revealed the truth. Mother, I was never deported, and I was never poor. I only wanted to test my family to see if they truly loved me as they always claimed over the phone. Upon hearing this, his mother burst into tears. But Daniel hugged her tightly and said, please don't cry, mother. I am rich and very wealthy. I also came back home to take a wife. At this, his mother's sorrow turned into joy. Daniel then told her, I am already in love with Isabella, and I intend to marry her. Hearing this, his mother's face lit up with happiness. A few days later, Daniel finally gathered the courage to speak with Isabella, making his intentions known to her. She listened carefully and then asked him for some time to think about it. Daniel, understanding her need for reflection, smiled and told her that it wasn't a problem. She could take all the time she needed and give him her response when she was ready. Meanwhile, Isabella still believed that Daniel was a poor deportee. She had no idea about his true identity or wealth. That night, she lay in bed, thinking deeply about his proposal. After a week, Daniel approached her again and gently asked if she had made up her mind. With a warm smile, Isabella replied, yes, I will marry you. Joy filled the air as they both embraced each other, overwhelmed with happiness. 2 months later, Daniel began preparations to visit Isabella's parents and formally ask for her hand in marriage. As the wedding plans progressed, he decided to inform his brothers. He called them together and casually announced, I'm getting married in 2 weeks. His brothers were stunned. Confused, they exchanged glances, wondering how he could possibly afford a wedding when they had all believed him to be struggling. One of them, unable to hold back his curiosity, asked, how are you going to raise money for the wedding? Daniel simply smiled and replied, never mind. A week before the wedding, Isabella resigned from her job to focus on preparing for her new life. She was filled with excitement and anticipation. Daniel's brothers, however, remained clueless about what was really happening. None of them knew who their brother was marrying, and they certainly didn't suspect that he was keeping a grand secret from them. 2 days before the wedding, a group of Daniel's wealthy friends from London arrived in his hometown. Dressed in designer outfits and exuding confidence, they stood out from the locals. Daniel welcomed them warmly and led them to a magnificent mansion in the village. His friends marveled at the beauty of the house, but Daniel's family remained unaware of its existence. That evening, the night before the wedding, Daniel took Isabella to the mansion. Holding her hands gently, he looked into her eyes and said, there's something I need to tell you. He guided her through the grand entrance, revealing the luxurious interiors. This is my home, he said softly. Isabella's eyes widened in shock. Your home, she whispered, struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. Yes, Daniel said with a smile. I was never deported. I never lost my wealth. Everything I told my family was a test, to see who truly loved me. And you, Isabella, were the only one who stood by me when I had nothing. Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes, but they were tears of joy. She realized that she had chosen a man with not just wealth, but also a kind and wise heart. Tomorrow, she would become his wife, and a new chapter of their lives would begin. Isabella broke into tears as Daniel revealed his true wealth and the investments he had made over the years. Overwhelmed with emotion, she looked at him in disbelief, unable to comprehend how the man she had loved as a deported pauper was, in fact, a millionaire. Daniel gently wiped her tears and said, "You deserve everything, my darling, because your love was genuine. You loved me when you thought I had nothing. Now, everything I own belongs to you and our future children." He smiled and teased, "You married a deported man, but look where that brought you." On the day of their wedding, Daniel's brothers were skeptical. They hadn't contributed a single penny, nor had they helped with the preparations. Deep down, they hoped the wedding would be modest, assuming Daniel wouldn't afford anything grand. They didn't want to be embarrassed by a poorly organized event. However, little did they know that Daniel had meticulously planned everything to take them by surprise. The event center was decorated lavishly, exuding elegance and wealth. Everything sparkled, the flowers, the chandeliers, and even the guest tables adorned with gold-trimmed dinnerware. Isabella's wedding gown was breathtaking, the kind of dress that made everyone in the hall gasp in admiration. Guests arrived in luxury cars, and expensive gifts piled up at the entrance. The atmosphere was one of prestige and class. Daniel's brothers arrived 2 hours before the ceremony. As they stepped into the grand hall, their jaws dropped. Their eyes roamed over the opulence before them, struggling to believe what they were seeing. The youngest brother turned to the others, whispering, "Are we sure we're in the right place? Our brother who was deported couldn't possibly afford all of this." They exchanged uneasy glances, realizing something wasn't adding up. 30 minutes later, Daniel sent a driver to pick up his mother from their family house. Meanwhile, he had secretly bought a luxurious new home for his mother and siblings, but after witnessing their selfishness and lack of love, he decided to give the house to his mother alone. His brothers, who had once abandoned him in his time of need, would not benefit from his generosity. As the ceremony began, Daniel walked proudly down the aisle, hand in hand with Isabella. His brothers watched in stunned silence as high-profile guests from London congratulated him, calling him boss and sir. Reality finally sank in. Daniel had never been poor. They exchanged nervous glances, feeling the weight of their greed and selfishness. After the wedding, Daniel gathered his mother and wife in his new mansion. He looked at his mother and said, "Pack your things. You're coming to London with us." His mother wept tears of joy, knowing her son was taking her to a better life. 2 weeks later, Daniel, Isabella, and his mother left for London, leaving his regretful brothers behind. Years later, Daniel and Isabella were blessed with 2 sets of twin boys, completing their fairy tale ending. The end.